She walked up to the cake table at our 10th anniversary party, smiled at the room full of our closest friends and family, and said the words that ended my marriage in front of 80 witnesses, "I'm having your husband's baby." For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. My husband's face went white as the tablecloth behind him, and I felt my champagne glass slip an inch in my hand before I caught it. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 4 months quietly preparing for exactly this moment. Not this specific sentence, but something like it. I just never thought she'd be the one brave enough or stupid enough to say it out loud, in public, with a slice of our anniversary cake still sitting untouched on the table between us. They thought they'd humiliated me in front of everyone I loved. They had no idea they'd just given me the only thing I still needed. Before I tell you exactly how this played out, comment where you're watching from and subscribe if you believe karma always finds the people who think they're untouchable, because by midnight that night, this woman got an answer she never saw coming, and it didn't come from me. My name is Sophia Reyes. I'm 34 years old. I run a small but growing interior design firm out of a converted loft downtown, and until that night, I would have told you my marriage was solid, not perfect. Solid. Marcus and I had been together for 12 years, married for 10. We met in our early 20s, built a business together well. I built the design firm, and he handled the numbers, as he liked to call it, which really just meant he managed our joint accounts and occasionally pretended to understand invoicing software. We had a beautiful house in a quiet suburb, 2 golden retrievers, and a calendar full of dinner parties with people who called themselves our friends. The anniversary party had been my idea. 10 years felt like something worth celebrating properly, not just the 2 of us at a nice restaurant, but a real gathering. String lights in the backyard. A 3-tier cake from the bakery Marcus's mother swore by. 80 guests, most of them Marcus's family and business colleagues, because his family was large and loud, and mine was small and far away. I'd noticed things, if I'm honest, small things. Marcus staying later at the office than the numbers seemed to justify. A new cologne I didn't recognize. A habit of tilting his phone screen away from me at dinner. Something he'd never done in 12 years. But I'd also just come off the biggest year of my career, 3 major commercial contracts, a feature in a regional design magazine, and I told myself I was imagining things because I was tired, because success does strange things to a marriage, because surely, after everything we'd built, Marcus wouldn't be that reckless. I want to be honest about something. I didn't confront him about my suspicions. I did something quieter instead. In March, 4 months before the party, I hired a financial forensic consultant, not a private investigator digging through bedrooms. Nothing dramatic like that. Just someone who specializes in reviewing business and personal account structures. I told myself it was routine. I told myself I just wanted to understand our finances better since the design firm had grown so much. That part was true. But underneath it, I think I already knew I was looking for something else. What I found in the first 2 weeks was small. A recurring monthly transfer to an account I didn't recognize, disguised under a vendor name Marcus had set up for consulting services that didn't correspond to any actual work our business had contracted. $4,000 a month for the last year. $48,000 moved quietly into an account that traced back to a woman named Talia Brennan. I didn't say anything. Not to Marcus, not to my sister, not to anyone. I sat with that information the way you sit with a low-grade fever, aware something is wrong, not yet sure how bad it's going to get. By April, my consultant had traced Talia Brennan to an apartment 11 minutes from Marcus's office. By May, I had photographs not of anything explicit. Just Marcus's car, parked outside that building at hours that told their own story. By June, I knew 2 more things that changed everything. Talia was 26, she worked as a marketing coordinator for a vendor Marcus's company occasionally used, and she was, according to a public records, search my consultant ran almost as an afterthought, still legally married to a man in another state. A detail she apparently hadn't bothered mentioning to Marcus. I didn't confront him. I know how that sounds. But I'd learned something in my design business that most people never learn in their marriages. You don't tear down a wall until you know exactly what's holding up the ceiling. I needed to understand the full structure before I moved a single brick. So instead of confronting Marcus, I did something else entirely. I started quietly restructuring our finances. The design firm had grown enough that our accountant had been telling me for a year to separate my business assets more clearly from our joint household accounts for tax and liability reasons. I used that as my cover. In June, I moved the firm's operating accounts, its client contracts, and its intellectual property, including the commercial design portfolio that had just gotten us featured in that magazine, into a structure that was unambiguously, legally mine. Marcus signed the paperwork without reading it closely. He'd never read anything closely that didn't have his name in bold at the top. I also did something I'm not proud of, but I don't regret. I contacted the property management company that handled Talia's apartment building and, through channels I'd rather not detail, confirmed that the lease was in her name only, and that she had in fact listed her occupation as unemployed, pending relocation on a recent lease renewal application. Pending relocation. I remember reading that phrase and feeling something in my chest go very, very cold. She was planning to move in with him. Whatever this was, it wasn't a fling anymore. It had a shape. It had momentum. And they were building it entirely on the assumption that I had no idea it existed. By July, 2 weeks before the anniversary party, I had everything laid out clearly enough that I could have ended the marriage quietly, cleanly, with every financial advantage on my side, and Marcus never fully understanding how I'd known until his lawyer explained it to him. That was the plan. Quiet, controlled, no scene, no scandal, just a woman walking away from a decade of marriage with her business, her assets, and her dignity fully intact. Then, Talia Brennan decided she didn't want quiet. I still don't know exactly what made her show up at the party. My best guess, based on something Marcus's cousin mentioned weeks later, was that Talia had recently discovered she was 8 weeks pregnant and had given Marcus an ultimatum. Tell his wife the truth before the party, or she would tell everyone herself at the party. In the most public way possible. Marcus, coward that he'd always been at his core, chose to do nothing. He hoped, I think, that the moment would simply never come. The way he'd hoped for a decade, that I'd never look closely enough to notice the cracks. Talia walked into that backyard in a green dress that did nothing to hide the small, unmistakable curve she was clearly done trying to conceal. She walked directly past 3 of Marcus's aunts, past his business partner, past his own mother, straight up to the dessert table where Marcus and I were standing beside our anniversary cake, and she said it loud enough for the entire yard to hear. "I'm having your husband's baby. I want you to understand something about that moment, because I think it's the part people misunderstand most about betrayal. It isn't the words that destroy you. I already knew about the affair. I'd known for 4 months. What destroyed me, for exactly as long as it took me to set my champagne glass down without shaking, was watching Marcus's face. Not guilt, not shame. Panic, the panic of a man who had been so certain his 2 lives would never touch, that he genuinely hadn't prepared a single word for the moment they did. I looked at Talia. Then I looked at the 80 faces staring at us, waiting to see whether I'd scream, cry, throw my drink, collapse. I did none of those things. I said, quietly enough that only the people closest to us could hear, "Congratulations, you'll want a lawyer. He's going to need one too, and he's going to need it faster than he thinks." Then I turned and walked back into my own house, alone, while my husband stood frozen next to a cake neither of us would ever cut. That was 7:40 in the evening. What happened between then and midnight is the part I think you're going to want to hear. Because it wasn't a scene, and it wasn't revenge in the way people usually mean that word. It was 4 months of quiet preparation finally arriving at its purpose. At 7:40, I walked back into my own house while Marcus stood frozen next to a cake neither of us would cut. I didn't cry. I didn't pack a bag. I went straight to my home office, opened the safe where I kept 4 months of documentation, and made exactly 3 phone calls. The first call was to my attorney, Diane Castellano, who I'd already retained in June. I told her this day might come sooner than planned. She picked up on the second ring like she'd been waiting. "Say the word," she said, "and I file first thing tomorrow, with everything already attached." The second call was to my accountant, confirming that the transfer of the design firm's assets completed in June was fully executed and untouchable in any divorce proceeding. He confirmed it in under a minute. The firm, the contracts, the magazine-featured portfolio, all of it, legally mine alone. The third call was the one that actually mattered. I called Marcus's business partner, Doug Whitfield, a man who had spent a decade being flattered by Marcus's charm, and had no idea how much of the consulting fees he'd been approving over the past year traced back to an apartment 11 minutes away, and a woman named Talia Brennan. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I simply asked Doug if he had a moment tomorrow to review some vendor documentation with me, since I still had firm access to shared accounting software from when Marcus and I filed jointly. He said, of course. Business partners always say of course, right up until they see the numbers. Back outside, I later learned the party hadn't ended so much as it had frozen. Marcus's mother had pulled Talia aside, demanding to know how long this had been going on. Talia, apparently unwilling to be the only one embarrassed that night, answered loudly enough for half the yard to hear. 14 months, an apartment Marcus paid for, and his promise that he was already planning to leave me before the year was out. That detail didn't hurt the way I expected. By then, I already knew it. What it did was give me something else, a witness list. 14 people, according to my consultant's later interviews, heard some version of Marcus's plans directly from Talia's mouth that night. 14 people who would later remember, very clearly, that this wasn't a slip. It was a plan he'd been building for over a year, funded quietly with money that touched our joint accounts. By 11 the next morning, Doug Whitfield had gone through the vendor documentation with me and found what I already knew he'd find $48,000 in company-adjacent funds, funneled through an account with no deliverables, no contracts, no explanation except a woman's name that meant nothing to the business and everything to a divorce court. Doug didn't yell. He just went very quiet, thanked me for bringing it to him, and said he'd need to speak with the board about Marcus's role moving forward. By that afternoon, Diane filed. Not just divorce papers, a full accounting of separate assets, a formal notice regarding misappropriated joint funds, and a request that the court expedite, given the documented evidence of concealment. Marcus, blindsided by how fast and how thorough it all was, called me 11 times. I answered once. "You had 4 months to tell me the truth," I said. "I gave you every single one of them. You spent all of them lying to my face at dinner." Then I hung up, and I didn't answer again. Talia didn't fare better. Whatever future she thought she was walking into collapsed within a week. Marcus, forced out of his role pending the board's investigation, no longer had the income to support the apartment, the lifestyle, or the promises he'd made her. And when her own legal situation surfaced the marriage in another state she'd never bothered to end it, turned out she had far more to explain than either of us. 6 weeks later, the divorce settled almost entirely in my favor, the business fully protected, the misappropriated funds ordered repaid. Marcus's family, the same 80 people who'd watched Talia make her announcement, mostly chose me in the aftermath, not out of loyalty exactly, but because they'd watched, in real time, exactly who each of us really was. I saw Marcus once more, months later, in a parking lot outside a courthouse. He looked smaller than I remembered. He asked, almost quietly, if there was any chance we could talk. Really talk. Someday. I told him the truth. I spent 4 months preparing for the version of you that would finally tell me the truth on his own. You never did. There's nothing left to talk about. I walked to my car, got in, and drove back to the design firm that was, in every legal and practical sense, entirely mine. For the first time in over a year, Nothing about my life depended on what Marcus decided to do next.